Hello, this is Investigator of Things. Thank you for viewing. Today we're going to look at two sides of the DNA issue between chimps and humans. So make up your own mind, decide for yourself, subscribe if you will. That helps things, and enjoy. I'll see you next time.
Follow along this row here, chimp, human, identical, identical, identical. There's a difference. Walk along, walk along, walk along, all the same, identical, no difference at all between the human and the chimpanzee, exactly the same, exactly the same. Now we see another difference there, A versus G. Walk along, walk along, walk along, and there are no more differences in that whole row. Almost all of the human genome and the chimpanzee genome is identical. A tiny number of differences account for all the really quite large differences that we see between humans and chimpanzees.
The idea that human and chimp DNA overlap by 98 to 99% has been widely used to promote the idea that humans and chimps shared a common ancestor millions of years ago. But have you considered how they came up with this estimate? One of the things that not many people know about this study is that large sections of DNA from both the human and the chimp genome were left out when making this comparison. Let's see how Minute Earth, a secular training site that holds to an evolutionary perspective, describes it.
When researchers sat down to compare the chimp and human genomes, those single-letter differences were easy to tally, but the big mismatch sections weren't. For example, if a genetic paragraph, thousands of letters long, appears twice in a human scroll, but only once in its chimp counterpart, should that second human copy count as thousands of changes or just one? And what about identical paragraphs that appear in both genomes, but in different places, or in reverse order, or broken up into pieces? Rather than monkey around with these difficult questions, the researchers simply excluded all the large mismatch sections, a whopping 1.3 billion letters in all, and performed a letter-by-letter comparison on the remaining 2.4 billion, which turned out to be 98.77% identical. So, yes, we share 99% of our DNA with chimps if we ignore 18% of their genome and 25% of ours.
Wow, ignoring 18% of the chimp genome and 25% of the human genome. That's a lot to ignore. In fact, this
of differences account for all the really quite large differences that we see between humans and chimpanzees.
This represents hundreds of millions in each side of the comparison. Could the sections they left out be responsible for coding most of the obvious differences we see between humans and chimps?
Is it possible that in the line of evolution that led to us, a pair of chromosomes from a primate ancestor just got lost and just got discarded? Well, the answer to that is no, it's not possible. And the reason is because every primate chromosome has so many important genes on it that the loss of both members of a pair would be fatal. You wouldn't even get through embryonic development. So there's only one possible explanation. And that explanation is that in the line that led to us, two chromosomes that were separate in other primates became fused to form a single chromosome. And this is why evolution is a science. That possibility is testable. We ought to be able to look at our genomes and find that we carry a chromosome with the marks of that fusion on it. Now, how would we find that? It's easier than you might think.
Typically, on the ends of every chromosome, you should find special genetic markers, or sequences of DNA, called telomeres. And in their middles, you should find different genetic markers called centromeres. But if a mutation occurred in the past, causing two pairs of chromosomes to fuse, we should find evidence in those genetic markers. Telomeres not only at the ends of the new chromosome, but also at their middles, and not one, but two centromeres.
But what they admit is that it should have left two centromeres, but there is only one now. So the evolutionists are admitting that there's only one now, and
Finding a structure like this in our chromosomes would explain why humans have one pair fewer than the great apes.
But they actually reported this back in 2002, but no one was really talking about it. But they sequenced 600,000 bases of DNA surrounding this gene and found that it was in a gene-rich region. It was in a nest of other genes. And that none of these genes in this entire 600,000 bases are found in chimpanzees. So that, and of course my research showed that as well, but they hypothesized that all these genes got there by coming from other places in the human genome. They didn't come from chimpanzee. This is the evolutionary thinking, the mindset. They didn't come from chimpanzee because there was no comparison to make. So they just came from other places in the human genome. So they just somehow ended up there through different mechanisms, supposedly.
So there's only one possible explanation, and that explanation is that in the line that led to us, two chromosomes that were separate in other primates became fused to form a single chromosome. And this is why evolution is a science. That possibility is testable. We ought to be able to look at our genomes and find that we carry a chromosome with the marks of that fusion on it. Now, how would we find that? It's easier than you might think.
Carefully observe chimps, look at them and look at humans and make long lists and interesting lists of things that differ between humans and our closest living relatives. And these lists then are in some sense an answer to this question. What is it that is unique about humans? How are we different? Because every human individual starts with this genome, which resides on chromosomes that you get from your mother and your father. Everybody in the room started life as a single fertilized egg with largely just the information that's encoded on our chromosomes, and it specifies these human differences. Every human is completely heritable for these human characteristics, and likewise for the chimpanzee. We would really like to know how this genetic information encodes these differences. What is it that differences between humans and chimps, what is this map between these genetic differences and the biological differences that we might care about?
Finding a structure like this in our chromosomes would explain why humans have one pair fewer than the great apes.
If we don't find it, then the case for common ancestry for our species might be refuted.
So this then is kind of the playing field for defining the genetic basis of human uniqueness. We've got these millions of things to look at genetically and long lists of biological and behavioral and physiological differences, and we'd like to make a map. But that's a hard problem. There are many millions of these things, and understanding the biology behind them, how the genetic information goes through all the steps that Ajit talked about, through gene expression and protein expression and interacting with the environment to make the differences between humans and chimpanzees.
Much here, but we need to understand what the argument is, okay? But what they admit is that it should have left 2 centromeres, but there is only 1 now. So the evolutionists are admitting that there's only 1 now, and the reason why they said that there were centromeres here, and the evidence for it, is that every human and great ape chromosome centromere contains a highly variable DNA sequence that's repeated over and over again. It's called the alphoid sequence. It's a 171 base pair sequence that are in centromeres, and so they say, well, we discover these alphoid sequences where we think the centromeres are. But the problem is alphoid sequences aren't limited just to centromeres. If they were to use that argument, you'd have to think that there were old centromeres all over the human genome. So it's not a really good argument. And the other thing is the centromere that is there now is in a totally different place than the 2 centromeres would have been. So they have to think that 2 degenerated and 1 popped into place.
So you've got different telomeres and different centromeres. So why are they talking about the similarity? It seems like the data is speaking very loudly against those being fused.
Exactly.
Finding a structure like this in our chromosomes would explain why humans have one pair fewer than the great apes.
If we don't find it, then the case for common ancestry for our species might be refuted.